Some wars are remembered as grand victories, while others turn into epic legends, passed down through generations. But then, there are those wars that a nation would rather forget. For the United States, that war was Vietnam, a story that many found uncomfortable, a chapter that some tried to skip altogether. But to really understand America today, we have to look back at this conflict that changed everything. It didn't kick off with the dramatic declaration of war or a single moment you can point to and say, that's when it started. Instead, it crept in quietly, almost invisibly. After World War II, the world was split in two, democracy on one side and communism on the other. American leaders were haunted by this idea they called the domino theory. They believed that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would tumble one after another, just like a line of dominoes. And Vietnam, a small distant nation in Southeast Asia, was seen as one of those crucial dominoes. At first, the American commitment was pretty small. The USA sent military advisors, not combat soldiers. Their job was supposed to be straightforward: train, support, and observe the South Vietnamese army as they battled the communist North. But here's the thing: limited involvement is a slippery slope. The situation on the ground was complicated and deteriorating fast. Little by little, the mission expanded. The number of advisors grew, and their roles became more active. The line between advising and fighting started to blur. By the mid-1960s, what began as a quiet mission had morphed into a full-scale war. American combat troops began arriving in massive numbers, and hundreds of thousands of young men, many just out of high school, were drafted and sent halfway across the world. Can you imagine that? Dropped into a world they couldn't possibly have imagined: dense, sweltering jungles, flooded rice paddies, and remote mountain highlands. This wasn't the kind of war their fathers had fought. There were no clear front lines to advance across. The enemy, the Viet Cong, didn't always wear a uniform. They were farmers by day and fighters by night, blending seamlessly into the civilian population. Victory wasn't measured in territory gained, but in a grim statistic called the body count. It was confusing, exhausting, and deeply unpredictable. Back home, the American public was being told a very specific story. Government officials and military leaders assured everyone that the war was necessary to stop the spread of communism. They insisted that progress was being made, that there was light at the end of the tunnel, and that victory was just around the corner. But then, people turned on their televisions. For the first time in history, war wasn't a distant concept described in newspapers. It was a nightly broadcast, beamed directly into American living rooms in vivid, shocking color. People saw images of burned villages, terrified civilians, and exhausted, hollow-eyed American soldiers. They heard the sounds of gunfire and helicopters. This created a jarring disconnect, a credibility gap between what they were being told by their leaders and what they were seeing with their own eyes. Public trust began to crack. As the 1960s wore on, the war dragged on, a seemingly endless conflict with no clear end in sight. The number of troops in Vietnam swelled to over 500,000. The number of casualties climbed higher and higher, and the questions grew louder and more urgent. Why are we really fighting this war? What is the ultimate goal? Is any of it worth the staggering cost in human lives? This growing unease exploded into a massive anti-war movement. College campuses became the epicenters of protest and resistance. Millions of Americans from all walks of life took to the streets, openly and passionately opposing their own country's war. This was unprecedented. Never before had a war been so widely and fiercely questioned by its own citizens while it was still being fought. The conflict didn't just divide the nation politically, it tore through the very fabric of society. It split families, pitted friends against each other, and created a massive rift between the younger generation and their elders. For the soldiers, returning home was another battle. Unlike the heroes of World War II, they weren't welcomed back with ticker-tape parades and celebrations. Instead, they were often met with silence, indifference, or even open hostility and criticism from a public that had turned against the war. Many struggled deeply to readjust to civilian life, haunted by what they had seen and done. They carried the invisible wounds of a war that their own country seemed desperate to forget. The Vietnam War fundamentally changed how Americans viewed their government and their leaders. That unquestioning trust was gone, placed by a deep-seated skepticism. This skepticism turned to shock in 1971 when a set of classified documents, known as the Pentagon Papers, was leaked to the press. These secret papers revealed a stunning truth. For years, top government officials had privately questioned the war's purpose and its chances of success, all while publicly defending it and escalating the conflict. The credibility gap became a chasm. Trust in the government collapsed. By the early 1970s, the reality was undeniable. The war could not be won in the way America had once imagined. In 1973, after years of painful negotiations, the last U.S. combat troops were withdrawn from Vietnam. 2 years later, in 1975, the city of Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces. The war was officially over, but its legacy was just beginning. The cost was immense. More than 58,000 Americans lost their lives. Well over 1 million Vietnamese soldiers and millions more civilians were killed or wounded. A generation of Americans was forever marked by the conflict. Vietnam reshaped America's entire relationship with war and its role in the world. It taught brutal lessons about the limits of military power, the importance of government honesty, and the true cost of decisions made in faraway offices. For many years after it ended, the Vietnam War was the story America didn't want to tell. It was too painful, too divisive, too complicated. But history doesn't go away just because it makes us uncomfortable. The war didn't destroy American confidence, but it forced America to look in the mirror and ask hard questions about itself. Sometimes, the most difficult stories are the most important ones to remember. They remind us of our past, teach us about our present, and guide us toward a better future. So, what can we take away from this? It's about understanding the complexity of our actions and the impact they have not just on ourselves, but on others around the world. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this story important, consider subscribing for more deep dives into history. Let's keep the conversation going, because these stories matter.